I'm the manager of school meal policy and engagement with Hunger Solutions New York.
Tell me a little bit about what that is and what your role is
Like,
there.
yeah, so Hunger Solutions New York is a statewide anti-hunger organization. We work to expand access and participation in the federal nutrition assistance programs. Um, those all include SNAP, WIC, school meals, after school meals, summer meals. But my job specifically is through the last 10 years has been working one-on-one with school districts to expand access to school meals. So increasing participation, but also helping high poverty schools offer free meals for all kids. This role of manager of policy and engagement is really a shift since I started leading the coalition work for healthy school meals for all. So a big part of my role now is managing the coalition, the statewide coalition of over 150 different organizations working towards a statewide free school meal policy.
So tell us a little bit about what you're working on now.
Yeah, so my work right now is really, and over the last year, since the federal government allowed COVID waivers to expire at the end of last school year, we are working with a coalition of diverse organizations to implement a statewide policy that would establish free school meals for every student in New York State. So we're working on this to get this done in the upcoming budget session. So we're hoping that we'll see this in the final state budget for 2024.
So you're talking about free, because I'm trying to think back of, sometimes when I do these stories, I'm at a disadvantage because I don't have kids. So sometimes I'm like, wait, what was it the way when I was in high school? So I'm wondering if, I think when I was in high school, you had to bring money. You had to pay for lunch. If you got a bagel, you had to pay for the bagel. If you got and so what you're trying to do is just change that completely and make it so that nobody, is that what am I understanding it correctly?
Any school can operate the federal nutrition assistance programs. These programs, any child can eat who attends a school that offers these programs. However, certain kids from certain incomes can receive meals at no cost. Those families need to submit an application, or in some circumstances, families are on other means-tested programs like SNAP or public assistance. And so they're receiving free meals because of that status. The remaining kids do have to pay a meal in New York, pay for that meal. In New York State, I think it was 2018, the state eliminated the reduced price copayment. So there is like this category where kids would have to pay a copayment that's a lower price, but New York State already covers that cost for those reduced price kids.
So what you want to do is to change that through the budget. So how do you, like, what are the logistics behind that? Like, that's probably a lot more complicated than it seems to get something like that done, correct?
So what the big piece of this policy is, it builds on the existing federal program. So luckily, all this infrastructure already exists in schools where they're operating school meal programs. What we're asking for is an additional state supplement to make these programs whole. So that means that they're getting the same reimbursement regardless of what kid eats. They're getting that cost back for each meal. Right now, under the current system, it depends on the status of that child. So it comes with a lot of administrative burden. So you're tracking kids by meal category, by their income. And this really simplifies the process of all kids can eat, and schools then get all that reimbursement for each child that eats. I think it's the most simple way to explain it.
So where do you stand now with this change?
So right now, we are hopeful that this will be included in the executive budget for the governor. That's anticipated in early February. I think February 1st is the deadline for that. So that's our first benchmark that we're really hoping to reach. We have had positive reception in the executive chamber, also within both the Senate and Assembly. This has been a very popular and warmly received policy. What it comes down to is really the cost of whether they're going to make this work in the budget. The cost for this program would be about 200 million in terms of reoccurring costs each year to add that additional supplement so all kids can eat for free.
And in terms of what they're eating at schools, like, what do we know? I mean, like I said, again, I don't know about what our school meals are today. I only know what they were like 20 years ago. So our school meals, have they changed or evolved in how healthy or nutrition filled they are, or are they like the same as they were 20 years ago?
So school meals that we had 20 years ago are not the same school meals that kids are receiving in schools today. In 2010, the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act at the federal level really transformed nutrition guidelines for school meals. So just some basics, all school meals must meet certain nutrition guidelines in order for them to be eligible for reimbursement from the state and federal government. So these nutrition guidelines now have more fruits and vegetables. They prioritize whole grains. They limit sodium. They have some considerations with fat and flavored milk. So really transformed the way that meals are served and what's on that tray in the cafeteria. But beyond that, since those changes have put into place, there has been a ton of research around how school meals across all incomes are really the healthiest meals that kids receive during the day in terms of balanced nutrition.
It's sometimes the only meal a child gets, unfortunately. Is that still something?
So
still a
yeah,
thing?
Absolutely. So luckily there are income guidelines in place. And so our lowest income families are able to get access to free school meals. And we saw that the prioritization of that through the pandemic. Schools were hesitant to close when the COVID-19 pandemic hit because of access to school meals. And that was really a central concern. And that's really what encouraged the federal government to deploy some waivers to allow them to offer meals and have families pick up those meals throughout the pandemic. So we saw really evidence that school meals were a critical lifeline for kids. And so I think what's important too is that it also misses out on a lot of families who are in that same situation. So income guidelines for a family to receive meals at no cost in New York, for a family of 4, that's just about $51,000 a year. To be exact, $51,400 a year. If you make just $1 over that, you're over the income limits in order to make to be eligible for free school meals. And so what we're seeing now is really a disheartening situation where schools are needing to deny applications for just being sometimes even a few $1,000s over that income limit. Those families are then accruing debt at school. So in New York, we also have some language and a bill that makes sure that kids aren't discriminated against if they don't have meal money for meals. So schools are required to make sure that they still are feeding those kids. But then what happens is there's school meal debt. And so that's really a huge concern this year. Prior to the pandemic, it was about $25 million a year across the state of school meal debt. So these are families that fall just above those income guidelines, but are unable to make ends meet. And we're hearing from districts that their school meal debt is really coming not from parents' negligence, but parents who are applying and trying to get this benefit, but are just above that. And when they're making choices between paying their mortgage and skyrocketing prices in the grocery store and just cost of living being really difficult for families, this is really the conundrum that we're seeing now that we're back to this tiered payment system where some families are eligible and some families are not.
What would happen if if this actually went through? Would the debt be relieved? Like, is there any talk about, I mean, how much debt can you accrue at a school for lunches? Like, seriously, do you know what I mean? Like, I'm wondering that, number one. I'm wondering too, if they're going to forgive that debt.
So that's a great question. So the way that our proposal sits does not necessarily address that past debt. What's important to note, though, and I think what is a common misunderstanding with school meal programs, is that a school meal program fund is a nonprofit fund within the school district, separate from all of its other buckets of money, or general funds, is how they say. So this program has to operate within its own margins. It needs to break even at the end of the year. So any additional funds, which was the case for high poverty schools with free meals for all, did have excess funds and were able to invest that back into their program. The majority of schools, though, that don't have free meals for all programs, when they end up with debt at the end of the school year, and really there is no limit of debt of what a child can accrue. And so, but the problem is, and we are seeing one example that really stands out to me, is a rural district around me. So I'm in Saratoga County, and so this is in Washington County. This district of about 850 students is on a projection of about $20,000 in school meal debt by the end of the year at the rate that they're accruing already this year. $20,000 in a small rural district is an equivalent of a teacher's aide salary. And so really what we're talking about here is that I should back up a little. So at the end of the school year, that account that's independent of its own, the school district needs to take care of that if that's $20,000 over debt, for example. So that money needs to come out of the general fund in order to make that program whole each year. So really kind of that debt resets each year because of the nature of the nonprofit account. But what we're talking about here is at the end of the school year, and what I've talked a lot about with different legislators, is this second cliff that's coming. Right now, we saw this first cliff of families losing free school meals and now facing accrued debt, getting phone calls from their school district. And it's proven too that families are now less engaged with their administrators, less engaged at the school because they're getting calls about debt. And so that has a detrimental impact on the relationship between families and schools. And so what we're really asking with this policy is to end that, but also looking at what's coming at the end of the year when that account needs to be made whole. What are then the ripple effects that are going to happen at each local school district that's losing $25,000 when they're already having limited resources? That funding should be going to an additional teacher's aide, Chromebooks, and things that they need for education. But instead, it'll have to come out through covering debt.
Yeah, I think.
Sorry, I feel like I threw a lot at you.
No. It's interesting, and conundrum is. I just think that was a good word. It's a lot, and you just don't even. It's hard to think about a little baby, not getting a meal.
I think the thing that through this, so we're not alone. In New York State, we are one of, I think it's 9 different states that have active campaigns. California, Maine, and Colorado have passed this legislation. Massachusetts, Vermont have temporary legislation for this year and are working to make this permanent. So we're not alone in terms of that. And I forgot actually my original point with.
I don't know. I was listening. I was locked in, so I'm not sure.
Yeah. So other states have done this to make this happen for their schools. I had an original point to go back to. I think it was about debt, but no, unfortunately, a lot of times what we see is like GoFundMe's happening at the end of the school year, different things that that are taking place. And I think one of the things, this is what I was going to say, that has resonated with me most of kind of working with other advocates that are working on this across the nation, is thinking about this in the sense of a child accruing debt and means testing children in an institution where they're required to attend is just inherently broken. We don't need to test our kids for school for any other service at school other than school meals. And so this is really a sea change of how school meals really has always been. And we know for a fact that offering free meals for all kids is something that just works. We saw it through the pandemic, but prior to the pandemic, there's been a federal provision that allows high poverty schools to offer free meals for all. About 60% of schools in New York offer free meals through the community eligibility provision. So that's CEP. So if you may know districts maybe in your area that are already offering free meals, we know that all our large districts, New York City, Yonkers, Albany, Syracuse, Rochester, Buffalo, all those large city school districts are able to offer free school meals through the federal provisions because they have high enough poverty in order to make that happen. What we're doing now is really looking at the rest of the state. There's about 2,000 additional schools, and how do we really kind of close the gap, make this an equity issue, really, and no matter what zip code you attend, being able to have access to a basic need at an institution where you're required to attend just is a no-brainer. And we've heard time and time again, it is a no-brainer. But it is a really critical investment, not only in schools, not only for families for economic relief, but we know that it supports student outcomes in terms of academics, in terms of behavior. We know that it advances equity in terms of health. So really just the benefits are limitless. It's really just a matter of getting it done now in New York.